My son will never hear my voice. That phrase echoed in Fernando Almeida's head every night before sleep, like an unappealable sentence, a truth etched in stone that he'd carried in his chest for 12 years. Fernando was one of Brazil's wealthiest men, his fortune built brick by brick since he was 19, when he left his parents' home with nothing but a backpack and an insatiable desire to prove to the world he was capable. At 52, he had everything money could buy: mansions, imported cars, a private jet, companies spread across 3 continents. But none of it mattered, because the only sound he truly wanted to hear, the voice of his own son calling him Dad, was something money could never purchase. If you've ever felt you've lost something so precious that no amount in the world could bring it back, if you've lived with the crushing weight of guilt that seems beyond forgiveness, this story will move you in ways you might not be prepared for. Because what happened that Thursday morning when a humble housekeeper showed Fernando something changed not only his life but also my understanding of what it truly means to be a father. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you a simple thing. If you enjoy hearing real stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on life, subscribe to the channel. Every week we bring stories like this about people who have gone through situations you might be experiencing right now. Your subscription helps me continue bringing these stories, and I promise each one will be worth your time. Because here we don't just talk about money or success, we talk about pain, regret, second chances and miracles that happen when we least expect them. Fernando's mansion sat atop a gated community in Alphaville, São Paulo. It was an imposing 3-story structure with mirrored windows that reflected the blue sky by day and the city lights by night. The garden was immaculate, grass cut with millimeter precision, imported flowers exuding a sweet perfume mingled with the scent of wet earth after the 6 a.m. automatic irrigation. Inside the house, the silence was heavy, a silence that seemed to scream in the absence of life, the absence of a child's laughter, loud music, or mess. Everything was organized, clean, cold. The Italian marble stairs gleamed so brightly you could see your own reflection as you ascended. The white walls were adorned with expensive paintings by artists Fernando never had time to truly know. He'd just bought them because someone said they were valuable. There was a home theater, a fully equipped gym, a climate-controlled wine cellar stocked with bottles that cost more than a common car. But none of it brought warmth. None of it filled the void. Fernando woke up every day at 5:30 a.m., not because he had to, but because he couldn't sleep. His nights were populated by recurring nightmares, always the same dream. Him chasing a little boy with brown hair and eyes just like his, shouting his son's name, Pedro, but the boy never turned, never looked back, just ran faster and faster until he disappeared into a white, suffocating mist. Fernando would wake up in a sweat, heart pounding, throat dry, and get out of the empty king-size bed where he'd slept alone for over a decade. He'd go down to the kitchen, make strong, black coffee, no sugar, and stand there looking out the window before the sun had even risen, thinking about all that could have been different. His routine was always the same. Breakfast alone, endless video conferences with executives in New York, London, Tokyo, lunch in front of the computer, usually something the cook left ready that he ate without tasting, more meetings, more numbers, more deals, more money flowing into accounts that were already too full. At night, he'd go up to the office on the 3rd floor, a room that felt more like a temple of solitude, with mahogany shelves filled with books he never read, business awards he never truly celebrated, and a huge window overlooking the illuminated city below. And it was there, in that office, that Fernando would open his desk drawer every night and take out an old, faded photograph, its edges creased from so much handling. In the photo, a 5-year-old boy smiled, holding a chocolate ice cream. His face was smeared with melted ice cream, his eyes shining with pure joy, the kind of joy only a child can feel from simple things. Beside the boy, Fernando appeared younger, his hair still black, without the grey streaks that now dominated his temples, his face unlined by the deep wrinkles around his eyes. He held his son in his arms and both of them smiled for the camera. That photo had been taken on an ordinary Sunday, in an ordinary park, in a time when Fernando wasn't yet a billionaire, wasn't yet powerful, but was happy. He looked at that image every night and felt his chest tighten as if someone were wringing his heart with both hands. Because back then, Pedro could still hear. Back then, his son still called him Dad. The accident happened when Pedro was 7, Fernando was driving. It was a rainy Tuesday, April 14th, and he was late for a crucial meeting with foreign investors that could change the company's trajectory. Pedro was in the back seat, playing with a red toy car, making engine noises with his mouth, completely oblivious to his father's tension. Fernando glanced at the dashboard clock every 10 seconds, pressed the accelerator, and muttered curses under his breath every time the traffic light turned red. The rain was heavy, the windshield wipers working overtime but barely keeping up with the water. And then, at an intersection, Fernando sped through a yellow light. He saw the truck coming from the left, but thought he had time. He didn't. The impact was brutal, a sound of twisting metal mixed with shattering glass and screams. The airbag exploded in Fernando's face. The seatbelt held him so tight it left a purple bruise on his chest for weeks. When it all stopped, when silence returned, he turned around and saw Pedro. The boy was pale, his eyes wide, a trickle of blood running from his forehead. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pedro wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He just looked at his father with an expression of pure terror, his mouth moving as if trying to say something, but no sound came out. The doctors said the trauma from the accident caused irreversible hearing loss. The impact had affected the auditory nerve in a way that medicine couldn't yet repair. Pedro was completely deaf. Overnight, the boy who loved music, who sang off-key children's songs in the shower, who laughed out loud watching cartoons, was plunged into a world of absolute silence. And Fernando could never forgive himself. Guilt gnawed at him like a slow acid, dissolving everything from the inside out. He knew he'd been irresponsible, that he'd prioritized a business meeting over his own son's safety, that he'd sped when he should have waited. His wife, Mariana, tried to comfort him in the first few months, but her hurt was too great, her pain too deep. She said she forgave him, but her eyes said otherwise. And 3 years after the accident, Mariana filed for divorce and took Pedro with her. Fernando didn't fight for custody. He felt he didn't deserve it. He thought his son would be better off away from him, away from the man who had stolen his hearing. Mariana moved to Portugal, taking Pedro to a specialized school for deaf children, and Fernando stayed. He stayed in Brazil, stayed in the empty mansion, stayed immersed in his work as a way to escape the pain, as a way not to think, not to feel. He paid for everything, sending absurd amounts of money every month to cover private school, therapies, trips, everything Pedro needed. But he never visited. He never had the courage. Because he knew that when he looked into his son's eyes, he would see the silent accusation. He would see the question Pedro could never ask aloud. Why did you do this to me? The years passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. Fernando built a financial empire, bought companies, opened branches, multiplied his fortune in a way he himself could no longer keep track of. But the more money he accumulated, the emptier he felt. He would walk the halls of the mansion at night, open doors to rooms that were never used, look at old toys stored in boxes in the basement, rusted toy cars, children's books with yellowed pages. He couldn't bring himself to get rid of these things. It was as if, by keeping the objects, he kept alive the memory of a time that would never return. The only person Fernando truly interacted with was Mrs. Lords, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for almost 15 years. She was 58, her grey hair always pulled back in a simple bun, her hands calloused from years of work, and a gentle gaze that held the wisdom of someone who had seen a lot in life. Mrs. Lords was discreet, efficient, but above all, she was human. She saw Fernando every morning having coffee alone, saw him go up to his office every night, and even without saying anything, she understood the man's pain. Sometimes she would leave a little note on his desk with simple phrases, things like, "You need to rest," or "The sky is beautiful today, take a look." Fernando never replied, but he kept all the notes in a drawer. Mrs. Lords had her own routine. She arrived at 7 in the morning, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, organized things, and left at 4 in the afternoon. But every Thursday, she stayed later because that was the day she did a more thorough cleaning of Fernando's office. And it was on one of these Thursdays, November 9th, that everything changed. Mrs. Lords was mopping the shelves when she accidentally bumped into a pile of papers on the desk. The papers fell, scattering across the floor, and among them a white envelope, sealed, with Fernando's name written in a childish, shaky handwriting. Mrs. Lords picked up the envelope, looked at it with curiosity, and noticed it was covered in dust. It had been there a long time, hidden among old documents, forgotten, abandoned. She hesitated for a moment, but then decided to take the envelope to Fernando. She went downstairs, knocked on the door of his bedroom where he lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. And when he opened the door, she extended the envelope and said softly, "Mr. Fernando, I found this upstairs. I think you need to see it." Fernando took the envelope, looked at the handwriting, and felt his blood run cold. He recognized that script. It was Pedro's handwriting, the way the boy wrote when he was still learning, before the divorce, before he left. Fernando stood there, holding the envelope as if it were a bomb about to explode, his hands trembling, his breath caught in his throat. Mrs. Lords sensed the impact, lightly touched his arm and said, "It will be all right, sir. I'll leave you now." And she left, closed the door, and left Fernando there, alone with that piece of paper that seemed to weigh a ton. He returned to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the envelope for long minutes. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would leap out of his chest. His hands were sweating. He was afraid of what was written inside, afraid of opening it and discovering his son hated him, would never forgive him, that he had lost his chance to be a real father forever. But at the same time, he needed to know. He needed to read it. So, with trembling fingers, he slowly tore open the envelope, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, unfolded it, and began to read. The letter said the following: "Dad, I know you're sad. Mom said you work a lot and that's why you can't come see me. But I wanted to tell you something. I learned a new language. It's called ASL. It's a language I make with my hands. And you know what's cool? Now I can talk in a different way. My teacher said I can talk to you using my hands. And you can learn too. I really want to teach you, Dad. I really want to tell you the things I'm learning at school. I want to show you the drawings I make. I know you must be very busy, but if you ever have a little time, even just a tiny bit, I'd like to see you. I miss you. I love you. Pedro." Tears began to fall before Fernando even finished reading. They streamed hot down his face, wetting the paper, blurring the blue ink Pedro had used. He read the letter again, and again, and once more. And each word was like a stab to the chest, but at the same time, each word was a door opening, a light entering a place that had been dark for too long. Pedro didn't hate him. Pedro wanted to see him. Pedro still loved him. And Fernando had kept that letter, had forgotten about it, had let it get lost among unimportant papers while his son waited, while his son missed him, while his son reached out, asking for his father's presence. Fernando sank to his knees on the floor. He clutched the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face, the kind of tears he hadn't shed since the day of the accident. He wept for all the lost years, for all the nights he'd spent alone, for every chance he'd had to call, to fly to Portugal, to learn ASL, to simply be there. He wept for his own cowardice, for running away, for hiding behind his work, for letting guilt build a wall so high between him and his son that it seemed insurmountable. But now, holding that letter written by small, loving hands, Fernando understood one thing. It wasn't too late. There was still time. He pushed himself up from the floor, splashed water on his face, grabbed his phone, and called Mariana. It was 4 a.m. in Brazil, which meant it was 8 a.m. in Portugal. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sounding tired and surprised. "Fernando, is everything all right?" He took a deep breath, trying to control his trembling voice, and said, "Mariana, I need to see Pedro. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been a coward all these years, but I have to try. I found a letter he wrote a long time ago, and I realized I made the biggest mistake of my life by distancing myself from him. Please, give me a chance." There was silence on the other end of the line, a long, heavy silence filled with old hurts and wounds that had never quite healed. Then Mariana sighed and said, "Pedro talks about you sometimes, you know. He asks why you never visit. I always make excuses, say you're busy, that you live far away. But he's not stupid, Fernando. He feels like you abandoned him, and I don't know if he'll want to see you." Fernando swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly, and replied, "I'll try. Even if he doesn't want to, I'll try. Because I can't live the rest of my life knowing I had the chance to fix this and didn't take it." Mariana fell silent again, and Fernando could almost hear her thinking, almost feel the weight of the decision she was about to make. Then she said softly, "All right, come. Come this weekend. I'll talk to Pedro and prepare him. But Fernando, if you come, you have to come for real. It can't just be a visit to ease your conscience before you disappear again. He doesn't deserve that. He deserves a real father, or he deserves to know it's better not to have one." Fernando felt his throat tighten, but he answered with a firmness he didn't know he possessed. "I'll be the father he deserves, I promise. If this story is resonating with you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this one. Here we tell real stories of people who faced the impossible, and I'm sure many of them will make you feel less alone on your journey. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where you felt the ground disappear beneath your feet? Have you ever had that moment when the person you trusted most disappointed you in a way you never imagined? Write, "I've been there" below if this story touched you in some way. Your comment might be exactly the message someone else needed to read today to know they aren't alone. Fernando bought his ticket that same morning. A direct flight to Lisbon, leaving Friday night. He had 2 days to prepare, 2 days that felt like an eternity and simultaneously passed in the blink of an eye. He went to a bookstore and bought 3 books on ASL, downloaded apps on his phone, and watched YouTube videos teaching basic signs. He spent hours in front of the mirror, practicing hand movements, trying to memorize how to say, "Hello, I love you, I miss you, forgive me." His hands felt clumsy, accustomed to holding pens and clicking computer buttons, not to making delicate movements in the air. But he didn't give up. He repeated, made mistakes, tried again, because he knew this was his bridge. This was his son's language, and if he wanted to reconnect, he needed to learn to speak in a way Pedro could understand. On Thursday night, the eve of his trip, Mrs. Lords knocked on his office door. She came in carrying a tray with hot tea and cookies, placed it on his desk, and stood there, looking at him with that motherly way of knowing when someone needed words of comfort. Fernando looked at her and said, "Mrs. Lords, thank you. Thank you for finding that letter. If it weren't for you, I'd still be living in this prison I built for myself." She smiled, a sweet, understanding smile, and replied, "Mr. Fernando, sometimes God places the right people in the right place at the right time. That letter was waiting for the moment to be found, and I'm sure your boy was waiting too. Go and be the father he needs. It's never too late to start over." The flight was long. 11 hours of agony on the plane. Fernando sat in first class but couldn't relax, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything but replay in his mind what he would say, how he would act, what Pedro's reaction would be. He imagined 1,000 different scenarios. He imagined his son running to hug him. He imagined his son turning his back and refusing to look at him. He imagined tears. He imagined anger. He imagined indifference. When the plane finally landed in Lisbon, Fernando was emotionally exhausted, but at the same time, a strange energy coursed through his veins, a mixture of fear and hope that made his heart race. He took a taxi straight from the airport to the address Mariana had given him. It was an apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Lisbon, cobblestone streets, old buildings with tiled facades, the smell of pastel de nata wafting from a bakery on the corner. Fernando walked up the stairs slowly, each step feeling as heavy as lead, and when he reached the door, he stopped, took 3 deep breaths, and rang the doorbell. The door opened. Mariana was there, older, her hair shorter, a few new wrinkles around her eyes, but still with that firm, direct gaze. She stared at him for a long moment, and then simply said, "Come in." Fernando entered. The apartment was small but cozy, a stark contrast to the cold mansion where he lived. There were photos on the walls, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator with colorful magnets, a bookshelf filled with children's books, a worn but comfortable sofa. And there, sitting on the living room floor playing with building blocks, was Pedro. He was 19 now, no longer the little boy in the old photograph. He was a tall, thin young man with messy brown hair, simple clothes, and when he looked up and saw Fernando standing in the doorway, he froze. They stood there, frozen, looking at each other. Time seemed to stop. Fernando felt his legs go weak, felt the air drain from his lungs, felt every word he'd prepared evaporate from his mind. And then, slowly, with trembling hands, he raised them and began to make the signs in ASL. He signed, "Hi." He messed up. He tried again. He signed, "I'm sorry." His hands shook so much that the movements came out crooked, imprecise, but he kept going. He signed, "I love you." And this time he got it right. Pedro blinked, his eyes filling with tears, and he stood there, looking at the father who had disappeared from his life so long ago, the father who was now here, trying, clumsy and imperfect, but trying. And then Pedro raised his hands and began to respond in ASL, his movements fluid, fast, full of emotion. He signed, "Why did you take so long?" And Fernando didn't need a translator to understand. He saw the pain in his son's eyes, saw the hurt, but he also saw something else. He saw hope. He saw a door still open. Fernando fell to his knees on the living room floor. He extended his arms and Pedro hesitated. He hesitated for 1, 2, 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. And then he went. He threw himself into his father's arms, and they hugged with a desperate strength, as if holding on to each other to keep from drowning. Fernando felt his son's body trembling, felt his tears wetting the shoulder of his shirt, and he squeezed him tighter, whispering words that Pedro couldn't hear, but that he could perhaps feel in the vibration of his father's chest. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." They stayed like that for minutes that felt like hours. Mariana watched it all, leaning against the wall, her eyes glistening, one hand covering her mouth, seeing the scene she had waited for so long, but never been sure would happen. When they finally let go, Pedro grabbed a notebook and a pen from the coffee table and wrote, "Are you staying?" Fernando read it, looked into his son's eyes, and wrote back, "I'll stay as long as you want. And when I have to go back to Brazil, I'll come back again, and again, as many times as it takes, because I will never abandon you again." The following days were like a dream. Fernando rented an apartment near Mariana's, cancelled all his meetings, delegated everything to his partners, and for the first time in decades, he simply stopped. He spent his mornings with Pedro, learning ASL, communicating through gestures, getting to know the son he had left behind. He discovered that Pedro loved to draw, that he wanted to be an architect, that he had a girlfriend named Sophia who was also deaf, that he played drums in a band made up entirely of deaf people, that he had friends, dreams, an entire life that had continued without Fernando. And with each discovery, Fernando felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because his son had become an incredible young man despite his absence. Sadness because he had missed so much. He had missed the first drawings, the first school presentations, the first loves, the first doubts, the first fears. But he also understood that there was no point in crying over what was lost. What mattered was building what was still possible. One afternoon, Pedro took Fernando to the school where he studied. It was an institution specializing in deaf education, full of light, colorful walls, dedicated teachers who worked magic every day, teaching through their hands. Pedro introduced Fernando to his friends, and Fernando sat there in a chair too small for him, watching the young people conversing in ASL, laughing, playing, living, and he realized something he had never thought of before. Pedro wasn't less because he was deaf. He was different, and different wasn't synonymous with broken, incomplete, needing to be fixed. Pedro had his own language, his own culture, his own way of existing in the world, and Fernando had spent all these years thinking he had taken something away from his son, when in reality his son had gained something new. On the last day before returning to Brazil, Fernando and Pedro went for a walk in a park near the Tagus River. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and they sat on a bench facing the river. Fernando took out his phone, opened his notes, and typed a long message. He showed it to Pedro. The message read, "Son, I know I can't erase the years I was away. I know I failed as a father in every way possible. But I want you to know one thing. The accident wasn't your fault. Deafness isn't a punishment. And you don't have to forgive me if you don't want to, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve. I will learn ASL properly, I will be present, and I will love you the way you are, not the way I thought you should be." Pedro read the message, and tears began to fall again. He took the phone from Fernando's hands, typed a response, and handed it back. The response read, "Dad, I've already forgiven you. I forgave you a long time ago. I just wanted you to come back. And now you're back. And that's all that matters. Fernando read it, and something inside him that had been broken for so long finally began to heal. He hugged his son, and they sat there on the bench, watching the sun disappear over the horizon without needing words, without needing sound, just existing together. Fernando returned to Brazil 3 days later, but he didn't return alone. He returned with a promise, and for the first time in his life, he kept it. He traveled to Portugal every 2 weeks. He hired a private ASL tutor and studied 4 hours a day. He installed video calling cameras in every room of the mansion so he could talk to Pedro in ASL whenever possible. He reorganized his entire life to have his son at the center, not on the periphery. And 6 months later, when Pedro graduated from high school, Fernando was there in the front row, recording everything, crying with pride, signing "I love you" non-stop. 2 years after that, Pedro moved to Brazil to study architecture. Fernando renovated an entire room of the mansion, transforming it into a drawing studio with drafting tables, art supplies, everything his son could possibly need. And for the first time in nearly 15 years, the mansion stopped being a silent tomb and became a home. There was music now because Pedro played the drums and the vibrations made the walls shake. There were laughs because Sophia, his girlfriend, also moved in, and the two of them filled the house with life. There were family dinners, there were discussions about college projects, there were good-night hugs. And every Thursday, Fernando would head up to his office, open his desk drawer, and read that old letter that Mrs. Lords had found. He read it to remember. To never forget that we always have a second chance, as long as we're still breathing. That regret only has value if it turns into action. That kids don't need us to be perfect. They just need us to be present. And that sometimes a humble housekeeper with a huge heart can change an entire life just because she noticed a detail everyone else would overlook. If this story touched your heart in some way, I'm asking you from the bottom of my heart, please subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell stories. We create a space where real people share real pain and find comfort knowing they're not alone. Every subscription helps me continue this work, and I promise that every week you'll find a story here that will make you reflect, cry, smile, and above all, feel understood. And before you go, do me a favor. Write in the comments just one word that summarizes what you felt listening to this story. It could be hope, it could be strength, it could be pain. It doesn't matter what it is, because every comment down here becomes a chain of support for someone who might be going through the toughest phase of their life and needs to know that people care. Write, "This story moved me," if you felt something. Thank you so much for sticking with me this far. It means more than you can imagine. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and I'll see you in the next story. I'll be waiting for you here.